The topic that we'll consider for this week and next is the extent to which there are different First Amendment rules depending on the nature of the medium of communication and whether there should be. And the court has struggled with this issue each time it has been confronted with a new medium of communication. And sometimes it has botched the job, as it did when movies were invented in the early part of the 20th century and began appearing in movie houses around the country. A lot of cities concerned about the potential corrupting effect of what goes on in movies on the children of the community or on their sensibilities, established what are basically censorship boards to review films before they could be shown in the local movie house. One case out of a little town in Ohio made its way to the Supreme Court in 1914, and the United States Supreme Court found that there was no First Amendment problem at all in having municipalities set up censorship boards to screen films for their communities. No issue of freedom of speech or of the press. The court viewed the movie business as purely a business, subject to regulation like any other business, and did not consider that movies might qualify for protection under the First Amendment. And that was the law until the Mutual Film case was overruled in 1952, and the court finally acknowledged that movies are subject to protection under the First Amendment. True, they're not core political speech. Yes, they're just entertainment. Of course, now we have video games as covered by the First Amendment, so it's not much of a step from movies to video games. But it was significant in 1952 when the court finally acknowledged that movies are protected by the First Amendment. And around the same time, the court decided the case of Kovacs versus Cooper, which involved a newish medium of communication, sound trucks. You don't see or hear many of them these days, but after World War II, sound trucks would appear in communities, trucks or van, like little buses thing, with an amplifier system and not a microphone, whatever you call the thing, on the top that would broadcast whatever they wanted to broadcast, whether it was music or political pitches or advertisements for local businesses or whatever it was, as the sound trucks cruised through the community. And a small town in New Jersey, nice suburb, didn't want to be disturbed by sound trucks coming through the community and waking people from their naps or coming at inopportune times of the day or night or carrying messages that they really didn't want to hear, maybe commercial type messages, maybe not. In any event, this community passed an ordinance that prohibited sound trucks, and the case went to the Supreme Court, and the court noted that the ordinance was not content-based, which is right, isn't it? That is, the prohibition or regulation of sound truck speech didn't depend on what the people were saying on the sound trucks or the type of music that they were playing or whatever. So that it was content neutral, and the court could and should have treated the case as a garden variety time, place, and manner regulation. That is, that the city could regulate the time of sound truck communication, the place, the kind of neighborhood might be acceptable downtown or in a commercial neighborhood where it wouldn't be in a purely residential neighborhood, and manner being the manner of blaring speech out of the amplified system. But the court didn't at least use the term time, place, and manner, probably because that doctrine of regulating speech by its time, place, or manner hadn't really ripened and wasn't standard Supreme Court analysis. But in the course of deciding the sound truck case, Kovacs, the court paid attention to the unique characteristics of that medium of communication. And one of the justices, Robert Jackson, wrote a concurring opinion in which he said, this will sound a little quaint, but it was timely at the time the case was decided. He said, the moving picture screen, the radio, the newspaper, the handbill, the sound truck, and the street corner orator have differing natures, values, abuses, and dangers. Each, in my view, is a law unto itself. The takeaway from that, I think, is that the court would treat each medium of communication differently because of its different characteristics. And I think that overstates it significantly because the court has not done that, and yet it keeps saying every time it has to confront a new medium of communication that the First Amendment rules that apply to each medium may be different. Well, to get us closer to date and to the issues about differential regulation of different media, let's look at the fairness doctrine and the Red Lion case, which you are already familiar with from your experience with Minority TV. So we can sail through this quickly. The fairness doctrine grew up in the 1920s, in the earliest days of radio. When radio became a commercial medium in the 1920s, anybody with the wherewithal to buy the equipment, the antenna and the transformers and whatnot, could go in the radio business, and many did. And they started broadcasting over whatever frequency they liked. And the result, as the Red Lion decision says, was chaos. That people would be broadcasting on the same frequency at the same time and stepping on each other's signals, and it was a mess. And so the Federal Radio Commission was established in the 1920s to bring order out of that chaos and to nurture this new medium, to make it a useful medium. It was using the public airwaves, the frequencies available on the electromagnetic spectrum, which belong to all of us, and the government therefore considered that it had a legitimate role to play in regulating the use of our airwaves and assigning to each applicant for a broadcasting license the use of a particular frequency. And that's what the Radio Commission did. Then in the early 30s, the Radio Commission became the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, which of course still exists today. Well, along with allocating frequencies, the commission in the early days decided, and their statute, the statute that set up the commission, authorized it to regulate broadcast in the public interest. The slogan was something like the public be responsive to the public convenience, interest, or necessity, which is a standard phrase used by Congress when empowering an administrative agency to regulate some industry. Since the beginning, mainly in the 30s, there was the Interstate Commerce Commission back at the turn of the 20th century, but beginning in the 30s, the Congress set up a whole range of administrative agencies, sort of like a fourth branch of government, that were mostly industry specific, that they would establish the rules under which the various industries would operate. And that phrase, public convenience, interest, and necessity, was used in most of the laws setting up those agencies, as it was with the FCC. And in the early days, the commission decided that licensees, the beneficiaries of the government choice to give them the exclusive use of a particular frequency, that these licensees should be required to operate their stations in the public interest. And that meant, the commission said, that they ought to pay attention to, cover, put on the air information about the public issues of the day. And they ought to do so in a fair way, not a one-sided way, but in a way that gives voice to the views of the community, views that are representative of the entire community. And that they began to call the fairness doctrine. 2 parts. Cover the issues of the day, do so in a way that gives voice to opposing points of view, not all one-sided. And the fairness doctrine sat there for decades, not much enforced, and was never, its constitutionality was never tested in the Supreme Court until the Red Lion case. And Red Lion, as you see from the decision, is really 2 cases. It was a case involving Fred Cook, who was an author who wrote a book critical of then presidential candidate Barry Goldwater, a conservative senator from Arizona. And Cook was savaged on a local radio station operated by a Christian, right-wing Christian broadcaster, Reverend Billy James Hargis, as part of his Christian Crusade series. And he accused Cook, the author, of being a communist, of having done all sorts of bad deeds and consorted with communists and so on. And when Cook found out about the attack, he wasn't a listener of that radio station, but when he found out about it, he then demanded free airtime to come on the station and respond to the attack made on him, invoking what was called the personal attack rule, which was a sub-rule under the fairness doctrine. There was the fairness doctrine, the general fairness doctrine, and then the FCC put out 2 sub-rules. One that said that when somebody is attacked on the air, under the regulation as they put it out, when during the presentation of views on a controversial issue of public importance, that is, when the broadcaster is carrying out his fairness obligation, he's broadcasting controversial issues of public importance, when that's happening, an attack is made on the honesty, character, and so on of a person, the licensee, the broadcaster, has to notify the person, has to give him a tape or a script of the attack, and has to, this is a killer, has to offer him free airtime to come on the air and respond to the personal attack. That was one of the sub-rules. The other was the political editorial rule, which was similar, but it only applied to candidates for office, that when a station endorsed or opposed a candidate for office, the broadcaster had to do the same thing as with the personal attack. Give the candidate notice that we've just endorsed your opponent, or give the opponent notice that they just endorsed this other one, a tape or script, and an opportunity to come on the air and respond. Those 2 rules were challenged by the RTNDA, the Radio Television News Directors Association, as not authorized by Congress and unconstitutional under the First Amendment. So there were 2 cases that went to the Supreme Court, and Red Lion decided together. The Cook case about his encounter with the Christian station, and the RTNDA case challenging the rules themselves. And the decision in the case was written by Justice Byron White, and the court found that the fairness doctrine generally and both of the sub-rules were both authorized by Congress and enhance rather than abridge the freedoms of speech and the press protected by the First Amendment. Well, and Justice White goes through the history that I've recounted, and then says that this is not a stretch, that the FCC's regulation through the fairness doctrine and its sub-rules was authorized by Congress because of the broad mandate that the Congress had given the Commission to regulate the medium, that is, public interest, basically. So that wasn't a big issue for the court, but what was the issue was whether the First Amendment prevented the Commission from enforcing these doctrines. And Justice White says the broadcasters challenge the doctrine on conventional First Amendment grounds. That is, that they say, look, we are First Amendment speakers, and we're entitled to say what we want, and we can't be required by the government, consistent with the First Amendment, to give voice to views that we completely disagree with, which is a familiar notion that we've encountered in this course. So that sets the background. Then White's analysis begins with the statement that differences in the characteristics of new media justify differences in the First Amendment standards applied to them, and uses sound trucks as his example, citing Kovacs versus Cooper, the sound truck case. So they're going to treat this medium differently from other media. And how is it different? Well, the court says there are substantially more individuals who want to broadcast than there are frequencies available. Therefore, government has a legitimate role in policing the industry, making radio a useful medium of communication for everyone. There's nothing in the First Amendment, White says, that prevents the government from requiring a licensee to share is frequency, and to conduct himself as a proxy or fiduciary with obligations to present those views and voices which are representative of the community. The most quoted portion of the decision in Red Lion is this: it is the right of the viewers and listeners, not the right of the broadcasters, which is paramount. Not the speaker's interest, but the listener's or viewer's interest is paramount, which is a notion not often seen in First Amendment cases. Occasionally comes up, the right to receive information being of importance. But paramount to the right of speakers is unusual. White goes on to say the First Amendment is supposed to preserve an uninhibited marketplace of ideas, not to countenance a monopolization of that market. It is the right of the public to receive suitable access to social, political, aesthetic, moral, and other ideas and experiences, which is crucial here. On the idea of government requiring a licensee to share the frequency, the court says government surely could have decreed that each frequency must be shared by all who wish to use it, each being assigned a portion of the broadcast day or the broadcast week. I mean, it strikes us as odd, but surely government could have done that, said to some station, yeah, you can broadcast on 7:40 a.m. from, say, midnight to noon. That's your territory. That's what your license covers, KCBS. But from noon to midnight, that's something else, an entirely different licensee. Would that violate the First Amendment? No way. The government clearly could have allocated the sharing that way. Well, White concludes from that the licensees can be required to share their frequency with the views representative of the community. The broadcasters, of course, argued that this is going to force licensees to self-censorship, because if the consequence of, for example, covering the issues of the day in an edgy way, including personal attacks on people, if the consequence of doing that is that they have to give up their airtime for replies, they're going to shy away from personal attacks. They're going to shy away from doing anything edgy. And there's kind of a chilling effect. Why would they do that? Because the airtime is what they have to sell. It's like giving away their inventory as a consequence of compliance with the fairness doctrine. And the broadcasters argued, well, this can be self-censorship, and the coverage of controversial public issues will be eliminated or at least rendered wholly ineffective. Justice White is unpersuaded by that argument, says that possibility is at best speculative, hasn't happened yet in the entire history of broadcasting. But if experience indicates that the net effect is to reduce rather than enhance the volume and quality of coverage, then there will be time enough to reconsider the constitutional question. In the Reader on page 343, Justice White does what he has done in several First Amendment opinions, which is emphasize what's not involved in this case. And it's helpful to compare what is not involved with what is. He says there's no question here of the Commission's refusal to permit a broadcaster to carry a particular program or to publish his own views. That's not an issue here. The licensees are able to do that. There's no question of government censorship of a particular program. There's no question of the licensee being required to carry the official government view. Those questions, White says, would raise more serious First Amendment questions. And then on this question of scarcity, spectrum scarcity, there's only so many frequencies available. The argument, even at the time of Red Lion in 1969, was that there's plenty of room on the spectrum and there are these alternative media that are growing up, and you don't really need a fairness doctrine in order to give the community a wide spectrum of views. And that scarcity is really an old concept. White says not entirely a thing of the past, and you have to realize that the broadcasters have attained their position now, entrenched on this frequency. Very difficult for anybody else. The barriers to entry into broadcasting or into getting a particular frequency are practically insurmountable, and they've gotten that advantage, the fruit of a preferred position, from the government, conferred by the government. And so the court concludes, what do we got here? What's that? Why is that here? Where's my man? Why is that there? I don't want to hear. What? Okay. Are we back? We back? Yeah, okay. Sorry. So the court concludes, last paragraph of the decision, here's what justifies government regulation of the content of broadcast in view of 1, the scarcity of broadcast frequencies, 2, the government's role in allocating those frequencies, and 3, the legitimate claims of those unable, without government assistance, to gain access to those frequencies to express their views and hear the views of their fellow citizens. In light of those 3 factors, the fairness doctrine is constitutional and the FCC can enforce it. So that's the court's decision, the most important decision on the broadcast medium ever. But, as you've figured out by now, the fairness doctrine doesn't exist anymore. Well, what happened to it? After Red Lion,